Hello, and welcome to Religious Rebels, a podcast where we push back on behavior-based religion, question Christianity's concepts, and seek to find Jesus in the awkward middle way of grace and truth. I'm Christy Lynn Wood. Hey everybody, welcome back to Religious Rebels. I'm glad you're joining me here today. So today we're going to talk about our weird evangelical obsession with emotions. And this is all based on a Substack letter that I wrote last week that went kind of mini viral. So it had a lot of comments and a lot of traction on it. And that let me know that I hit something that many of us are thinking about and struggling with. And so, when you write something, you can only have so many words. And I figured I probably have more than just 7 minutes to say about this. So let's go ahead and do a podcast episode on it as well. So we're going to just kind of talk about emotions and some weird things we've done with them as evangelicals and what we need to maybe rethink and deconstruct and reconstruct in terms of how we deal with and understand and look at our emotions. So this has all been kind of stirring in my head for a while now. As I was reading Karen Swallow Prior's book, I have it here with me, The Evangelical Imagination. I'm only about halfway through, and yet I just can't stop thinking and pondering and making connections about so many things within our evangelical culture and her book. So chapter 6 was all about sentimentality, sentimentalism, sensibility, and all these words that kind of relate to emotions. And as I was reading her book, I just continued to be just hit by this is what's going on with evangelicalism. And the last couple episodes I did talked about emotional manipulation within evangelicalism, especially regarding young adults and Gen Z on college campuses and stuff like that. So this all just kind of ties in together with just thoughts that are going on in my head about how we deal with emotions as evangelicals. Today we're going to talk about a few things. And I've got my Substack open in front of me so I can kind of just keep track of what I hope to talk about, what I plan on talking about on this episode, and taking those thoughts and then just expanding on them, hopefully in some ways that really just make you connect with what I'm saying, and hopefully just ask some questions and really just dig into your own experience with emotions and maybe your own understanding of them. So reading Karen's book, I was hit with this just emotional manipulation is not new. And when I was growing up in the cult, we were kind of obsessed with the 1800s, which is why her book is so interesting to me, because that's what she talks about, are this fantasy views of the Victorian age that we have as evangelicals. And there's so much you could say about that, maybe another episode, but just a view of how things should be. And back in the day, the cult days, we were very interested in the old-fashioned missionaries and the old-fashioned speakers and just all these people who were in the Victorian age and were creating this basically evangelical movement that kind of started it all. And so we were interested in these preachers and we were interested in these missionaries, and many of them had these events that are familiar to us as evangelicals. This is why we have events. You look at the history of D.L. Moody and of Charles Finney, who was a little bit controversial and very emotionally manipulative, and of George Whitefield and of the Wesleys and all these people who had these big events that drew in people and brought them to faith in Jesus Christ and then, changed their lives. You think about even Billy Graham, an evangelical, made this huge event and all these people came to Jesus with their faith and were saved. This is kind of our history as evangelicals. And as evangelicals, we have this history of emotion, being very just thinking emotion is an important part of our experience with Jesus, of our experience with God. And yet, as emotion plays into things, emotion is easily manipulated. And so there is this very interesting, weird obsession among evangelicals with emotions and with the desire to make people feel something almost as this genuine expression of their faith. If you don't feel something, are you really even saved, kind of a thing. And we may, depending on where your experience is, have experienced this to a greater or lesser degree as you grew up and as you were in different churches. So I talked about that in my Substack. And I talked about how emotions are not bad. Emotions are good. They were created by God to help us to make us in his image. But one of the things that Karen talks about in chapter 6 of her book is she talks about sensibility, and not like sensibility as in I have good sense, good common sense, but sensibility in the old-fashioned term, meaning like I have senses that I'm using to experience the world. And she talks about sentimentality and sentimentalism. So sentimentality is the idea of like feeling things, and that's not a bad thing either. Sentimentalism is when we feel things in excess. I'm going to read you this quote from chapter 6 of the Evangelical Imagination. It says, sentimentality itself isn't necessarily bad, but sentimentalism is an emotional response in excess of what the situation demands. It's an indulgence in emotion for its own sake. It is emotion that is unearned. Excessive emotion can develop from within ourselves, arising from our own individual propensities or personalities, but emotionalism can also be evoked by external manipulation. Guys, I read chapter 6 and I really honestly felt like she was responding to the last 2 episodes we did about emotional manipulation or revival. It just connected with me. An excess emotion that has not been earned. And she goes on to talk about like evangelical art and movies and music and all this stuff across the last 200-300 years. And it's so very similar. There is this push to create this emotion that is excessive. And honestly, I just was thinking about all these cheesy Christian movies that they make. And why do they feel so cheesy? And why do they feel so like heartwarming and kind of thing? And there was an excessive emotion. There's much to the cheesy Christian movies that is not actual reality. It's kind of like how we wish it would be, how we wish it would go, how we wish it looked, or how it's supposed to, quote unquote, look or go. But it's not reality. It's not how life really works. It's not the happy ending that really, it doesn't really tie up that way. We have this excessiveness and they make you feel something. And I love that, an emotion that is unearned. It's just so much what I've experienced in evangelical culture. And when you think about worship music, same thing. And we talked about this last couple of weeks of how worship music and the right chords and the right progressions can cause us to feel these things. And even some of that is like they're trying to wring this emotion out of you. And is that emotion that we're feeling really the Holy Spirit, or is it simply emotion for the sake of emotion? Is it that indulgence in emotion? Is it an emotion that's actually in accordance to the situation we're in, or is it excessive? So I just thought about that and I was like, wow, that is so legit. Like that is exactly the kind of thing that I've experienced and that I was talking about the last few weeks. But then as you go in even more, so evangelicals love to create emotion. We love to feel emotion. We want you to feel emotion. Emotion is this like thing we love. And yet, as you get into some of these evangelical circles, there are certain emotions that are not okay. There are certain emotions that are considered to be sinful or bad. And there's certain emotions that are celebrated and pushed. And then, like I said, other ones that are wrong. And I think this is just a very interesting thing and not healthy or good. And yet it is something that we deal with all the time. So growing up in the cult, it was very much like happiness and peace and gentleness was a good thing. And so you should always have this peace and gentleness and happiness and joy. And feeling any other emotions were bad. And even in the last few years, I've heard people, not in the cult, people in mainstream Christianity, using these phrases with their kids, like, let's just have a happy heart, like happy hearts. We need to work out happy hearts. And really just even like some of the baby wise stuff, just really telling your babies that they can't be crying kind of thing, that they can't feel these negative emotions. There's a lot of stuff within evangelicalism that's really twisted when it comes to this idea of certain emotions are sin. Emotions like anger and fear and anxiety and jealousy and all those uncomfortable emotions. Sometimes we call them negative emotions, but really they're neutral. Emotions should be neutral. They're not a positive or bad, a good thing. They're not a negative or bad thing. They're just neutral, but they're uncomfortable. And somehow the uncomfortable emotions have been labeled as sin. And the comfortable emotions, joy, peace, happiness, excitement, all that are considered to be positive or good. And as I was reading through comments on my Substack, there's just a lot of people who have been really, really damaged by this teaching. And it's just so wrong and yet so prevalent. And so I think about things that I've seen and things that I've experienced and things that I've heard on the comments from my Substack that just make me wonder, like, where did this come from? And how is it so widespread? And I really think it goes back to that sin control, body control formula that we have about what it means to be a Christian. And we talked about this like 3 episodes ago in the episode on Gnosticism and Gnostic Christianity. But this idea of like, I have to control my body, I have to control my sin. And so therefore, these things that feel uncomfortable or out of control must be sin and must be something to control. And we get so caught up in this idea of trying to be good and be holy and be righteous and be whatever it is. And I really think it comes down to just a view of sin that's not accurate and an understanding of ourselves that's not complete. So I just kind of want to go with that. And Karen talks about this again in chapter 6. She says the concept of sensibility was linked to emotion. We talked about this, which means most literally a movement out of. So emotion, a movement out of. In other words, an agitation or a responsiveness that begins inside the body and moves outward. Emotions are an agitation or response to something that we feel in our body and then move outward. And I'm going to say this again. They're neutral. They're not good or evil. They are a neutral experience of what it means to be human. They are a response to things that happen to us, and we feel them. And if you look through scripture, God also feels emotion. Jesus felt emotion. He felt the comfortable ones and he felt the uncomfortable ones. Jesus was in agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was angry. He flipped tables in the temple. Jesus was sad and he cried at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus felt uncomfortable emotions and he felt comfortable emotions. That is part of being a human being. And yet, in our evangelical obsession with sin control and body control, we have created them to be good and evil, which they're not. And as I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how we react to our emotions when we now think that they are good and evil, we do this thing called spiritual bypassing. And that terminology was created by the late author and psychotherapist John Welwood. And he defined the term spiritual bypassing as using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tastes. So basically, we use these spiritual concepts, these spiritual phrases, these spiritual ideas and practices to kind of sidestep actually dealing with uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable emotions, things that we haven't actually are willing to deal with in our hearts, to belittle these basic needs. So I have basic needs for things, but instead I'm going to belittle those basic needs and use these spiritual ideas, these spiritual experiences to try to bypass that and not really deal with that. And so instead of dealing with the reasons behind these uncomfortable emotions, the reasons behind our fear, our anxiety, reasons behind our anger or jealousy, reasons behind these things that are uncomfortable to us, we just use spirituality to bypass them and push them out of the way. And that's incredibly unhealthy. We are never going to be whole people when we are shoving these negative emotions out of the way and calling them sin, when we are heaping guilt and shame on ourselves and feeling like we have to fix what's wrong with ourselves, and when we're not understanding like what sin really is. And I talked about this in my Substack, and I said, I think that what the biggest problem is we are not really having a correct view of sin. We see sin and we think that it's just things that we do, things that we say, things that we think, things that we feel. We don't recognize that sin is like the corruption of ourselves. It's everything beautiful about us just twisted and mangled. It's that selfishness, it's that self-centeredness that just sneaks in and messes everything up. We can't make sin go away by ourselves. That's like the fundamental part of salvation for an evangelical believer. We can't do this by ourselves. We need Jesus to forgive us, to save us. And so as we jump into that for salvation, and we believe that, okay, I can't fix myself. I can't get to God by myself. I need Jesus to save me. I need his forgiveness. Great. But then right after that, often many of us go back into this law view of things where we are trying to do the things to make ourselves good and to please God. And this just doesn't work that way. We can't do it. We are so broken and so mangled and so corrupted. And our beauty is there and our goodness is there, but there's that tension, there's that paradox of beauty and brokenness that exists within us. And it's always going to exist within us, the side of heaven. We are never going to get it figured out and be perfect. But the beauty of the gospel is we don't have to. We don't have to figure it out because Jesus died to restore our relationship to God. Because the Holy Spirit exists to begin that restoration work in our hearts and to begin to create us into the person we were made to be. And because God looks at us and sees us with love and grace and forgiveness, because he's already taken care of every single problem that we have. We're not trying to like earn anything from him anymore. We're just accepting it. We're living in it. We're getting that gift and we're being his sons and daughters. And so as we can understand that view of sin, recognize that it's not something we're trying to get rid of in ourselves, that we're not trying to do anything to make it better, I think we really can become people who just rest in who we are. And if we can recognize that Jesus died to save us from our sin, and he died to restore our entire selves, our whole human selves, that our bodies are being decayed here in this world, but they're going to be restored in heaven. And that our personhood, every little bit of us, our mind, our emotions, all the things that we feel and the things that we think and things we experience, all of those are good, mangled, but good. And so how can Jesus restore those? How can he restore our emotions? And how can he restore like just our whole selves? So as we feel these uncomfortable emotions, to just sit with them and to recognize, what is it trying to tell me? Why am I having this response inside my body that's moving outward? Like, what is going on? What am I looking for? What do I need? What is this telling me about my situation, about myself, about people around me? And just becoming more in tune with our emotions, which then allows us to become more in tune with other people and their emotions, and allows us to become more in tune with God. When we are people who are trying to bypass and stuff and sin control, we're not healthy. We're not healthy people with ourselves. We're not healthy with others. We're not healthy in our relationship with God. And as we begin to just rest in the goodness and the grace and the forgiveness that he offers us through Jesus Christ, and the beauty of the restoration that he wants to give us through the Holy Spirit, we can rest and we can recognize I'm always going to mess up. But that does not stop God from loving me. I'm never going to get this perfectly right. But that doesn't make me not earn anything or earn anything. I am perfectly loved right now, who I am. And I can, in that rest and in that grace and that love, explore these emotions and explore why I'm feeling them and explore where they're coming from and not be afraid of them. I heard somebody talking about just how they were so filled with this guilt and shame over feeling fear and over feeling just nervousness about something that was going on in their life that was legit. Like it was a legit reason to feel afraid and to feel worried and to feel these uncomfortable emotions. But when you don't believe that those things are okay, you feel this guilt and shame. You're trying to make them go away. But recognizing like this is a reason to feel these ways. And yet even in the middle of this uncomfortable, hard time, I can choose to trust. I can choose to rest and I can choose to walk with God through this. But I don't have to fix this myself. I don't have to make myself feel better or feel differently. It's okay for me to feel these things. And I can choose to have that tension, that paradox of like, I am feeling afraid right now. I am choosing to trust God in the middle of my fear. Doesn't mean I don't feel fear or anxiety. It means that here in this place of brokenness and pain and hurt, I'm going to trust. Whether I feel it or not, I'm just going to trust. And if I still feel fear, I'm just going to trust. And just to recognize it's okay. It's okay to feel those negative, those uncomfortable emotions, and to just lean into them and say, what is this teaching me? And as we wrap this up, I just want to remind you guys one more thing. One of the things that has most impacted me as far as uncomfortable emotions is learning to lament. And lament is one of those things that we don't talk about much in evangelical culture. And yet I'm hearing it more and more, and I'm really glad, because it is a practice, it's a spiritual practice that is so necessary. And it's the idea of taking these really sad and hard things to God and just being sad with Him. Just being sad and being broken with Him. Not trying to fix it, not trying to feel better, but just telling Him, this is hard. This hurts. I don't like this. And yet in this place of brokenness and pain, I'm giving it to you. I'm giving myself to you. And I'm just going to hold on, recognizing that you're here and you hear me and you hurt with me. And we're just going to be in this together. We're not looking for an answer. We're not looking for a fix. We're just sitting there in that pain with Jesus and letting Him sit there with us. And it's been one of the best things I've ever learned how to do as I went through my spiritual abuse at the last church we were at 7 years ago, as I've been through other things since then. Like, it is a beautiful and important thing to learn to lament. So I would just encourage you guys and remind you, first of all, emotions are neutral. They're not sin. Ditch that. That's one of those ideas to deconstruct and throw in the trash. And then just learn to wrestle through those uncomfortable places to say, okay, where is this coming from? What do I need right now? What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this? And to recognize these emotions are very often speaking truth to us. Like, there is truth behind these emotions. There's something going on that we need to pay attention to. Our body is having a response because there's something going on that we need to recognize and look at. So, hope that encourages you guys. Like I said, I had a huge response to the Substack that I wrote. I'll link it in the show notes in case you're not on Substack with me. But I just want to encourage you guys, and just one more thing in our evangelical Christianity, to deconstruct and ditch and then reconstruct a faith that's centered around Jesus Christ. Full of paradox, full of tension, full of emotion. Thanks for listening, guys. Until next time, keep searching.